The day broke quiet and silver over Clearwater Ridge. A fine mist clung to the hollows, softening the edges of the vast Wyoming prairie until the sky and the land seemed to be dreaming of one another. The only sounds were the rhythmic, weary squeak of the windmill turning its face to a breeze that had not yet arrived, and the soft snuffling of cattle stirring in the corral, their breath pluming in the cool air of early morning. This was Evan Cooper's world, a world measured in the turning of seasons and the ache in his shoulders. He stood on the porch of the small ranch house he had built with his own 2 hands, a mug of coffee held in a grip that could gentle a spooked horse or drive a fence post deep into the hard earth. He was a tall man, towering over most, with a frame built for labor and a stillness about him that was often mistaken for something harder than it was. Inside, he was simply a man worn smooth by work and grief, left with few words after his wife. Martha had been taken by the fever 3 years past. He took a slow swallow of the coffee. It was bitter, but it was hot. That was all he asked of it. His focus was already on the fields, on the sea of grass that rippled in the dawn light. The haying season was coming on fast, a relentless tide that would demand every ounce of his strength from sunup to sundown. It was the heart of his year, the work that decided whether he and his daughter would make it through the long winter with comfort or with want. And he could not do it alone. Not anymore. Not with a house to keep and a child to raise. A small sound from the doorway drew his attention. Ruth stood there, a whisper of a girl at 7 years old, clutching a worn picture book to her chest as if it were a shield. She had her mother's wide, thoughtful eyes and a shyness that made her seem to shrink into the shadows. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. He returned it with a nod, the best he could manage most mornings. His love for her was a vast, silent thing, as big as the sky above them, but he did not have the tools to shape it into words. He could build a barn, mend a harness, read the clouds for rain, but he could not bridge the quiet space that had grown between them since her mother was gone. He knew she needed more than he was giving her, more than silent breakfasts and tired evenings. She needed a woman's touch in the house, a softness, a sound other than the creaking of the floorboards and the sigh of the wind. That was why he had ridden into town yesterday and tacked a notice to the board outside the general store. Help wanted, cook and housekeeper, room and board, plus monthly wages. A simple request for a simple, necessary thing. He finished his coffee, set the mug on the porch rail, and walked toward the barn. The day's work was waiting. It always was. The stagecoach from Cheyenne kicked up a cloud of fine, pale dust as it rattled to a stop in the center of Clearwater Ridge. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a saloon, a blacksmith, a general store, and a handful of other sturdy, unpainted buildings. For June Merritt, stepping down onto the solid ground, it felt like the edge of the world. She was 23, with a spirit as bright as her auburn hair, and a hope that had carried her all the way from a crowded parish in Ohio. She had come west seeking not a husband or a fortune, but a space big enough for her to breathe, a place where her skills could earn her a respectable living. She smoothed the front of her simple wool dress, took a firm hold of her valise, and walked toward the largest building, which had a sign that read, Alma's Mercantile, Provisions and Dry Goods. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful welcome. The air inside smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and cinnamon. Shelves groaned under the weight of everything a person might need, from bolts of calico and sacks of flour to shiny new axe heads and jars of penny candy. Behind the counter stood a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and hair the color of spun silver, pinned up in a neat bun. This had to be Alma. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice warm and welcoming. "You're new, just off the stage, I reckon. What can I get for you, dear?" "Good morning," June replied, setting her bag down. Her voice was clear and steady. "My name is June Merritt. I was hoping you might be able to help me. I saw a notice posted for a housekeeper position at a ranch owned by a Mr. Cooper." Alma's eyes twinkled with a knowing light. She leaned her elbows on the counter, making herself comfortable. Alma was the heart of Clearwater Ridge, the central hub through which all news and gossip flowed. She knew everything about everyone, not out of malice, but out of a genuine, bustling interest in the lives of her neighbors. "Evan Cooper," she said, nodding slowly. "You've come to the right place." That was his notice. Right enough. Poor man's been trying to hold that place together by himself since his Martha passed. He's a good man. Evan, quiet as a stone, but steady as one. 2. Works harder than any 2 men I know. But raising a little girl and running a ranch that size, it's too much. The house has been needing a woman's hand for a long time. She paused, studying June with a friendly but thorough gaze. "You have experience in keeping a house." "Yes, ma'am," June said. "My mother taught me well. I can cook, bake, clean, mend, and I helped with the children at our church school back home. I enjoy the company of little ones." This last piece of information seemed to please Alma immensely. Well, now, isn't that something? His little Ruth. She's a sweet thing, but shy as a fawn. Keeps to herself with her picture books. A gentle soul like you might be just what she needs. Alma straightened up, a look of decision on her face. "The Cooper place is about 3 miles out of town. You follow this road west, can't miss it. A sturdy house with a big barn and a windmill that groans like an old man with a toothache. You tell Evan that Alma sent you, and you tell him if he gives you any trouble, he'll have me to answer to." She winked, and her smile was as warm as fresh bread. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much," June said, a wave of relief washing over her. "You go on now," Alma said, waving a hand. "And when you get settled, you come back and see me. A girl needs a friend in a new town." The walk was longer than she expected, the sun warmer. The prairie stretched out around her, immense and beautiful, a tapestry of green and gold under a sky of impossible blue. It was a land that promised hardship and freedom in equal measure, and June felt a thrill of anticipation. She was not afraid of work. She finally saw the place, just as Alma had described it, a neat, solid house, a barn that looked bigger than the church back home, and the tall, spinning frame of a windmill, complaining softly in the breeze. As she approached, she saw the man himself. Evan Cooper was coming out of the barn, and for a moment, June simply stopped and stared. He was the tallest man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of immense strength. He stopped when he saw her, his expression unreadable from a distance. Beside him, a small girl in a faded blue dress half hid behind his long legs, peering out with wide, curious eyes. June took a breath and continued forward, stopping a respectful distance from the porch steps. "Mr. Cooper?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. He just nodded, his gaze direct and assessing. He was not a man for pleasantries. "My name is June Merritt," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt under that intense scrutiny. "I spoke with Mrs. Alma at the mercantile in town. She said you were looking for a housekeeper." He considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to the small, sturdy valise at her feet. "Alma said that, did she?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't unkind, merely deep and unused to conversation. "Yes, sir. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and clean, and I know my way around a kitchen. I can manage a garden, and I can mend. I'd be grateful for the opportunity." He looked down at his daughter, who was still peeking at the newcomer. "This is Ruth," he said, his big hand resting gently on her head. It was the first sign of softness June had seen in him. June smiled at the little girl. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ruth," she said softly. Ruth ducked her head, but not before June saw a flicker of interest in her eyes. Evan's gaze returned to June. He was thinking, weighing the costs and benefits in the silent, practical way he did all things. He needed help. The hay was not going to wait. This woman seemed capable. She was clean and tidy, and she looked him straight in the eye when she spoke. And Alma had sent her. That counted for something. Alma did not suffer fools. "The work is hard," he said, his voice flat. "Sun up to sundown. I'm in the fields most of the day during the haying season. The house, the meals, the garden, that would all be on you. And Ruth." "I understand, sir," June said. "I am not afraid of hard work." He gave another slow nod, a gesture of finality. The decision was made. The pay is $20 a month, plus your room and board. Your room is at the back of the house. It's small, but it's clean. You can start now. The midday meal needs making. There was no formal welcome, no tour of the house. It was a business arrangement, plain and simple. He needed a cook and housekeeper. She needed a job. The terms were set. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper," June said, relief making her feel suddenly light. "You won't regret it." He did not reply. He simply turned and walked back toward the fields, his long strides eating up the ground. Ruth lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on June, before she scurried after her father, a small shadow trailing a giant. June stood alone for a moment in the quiet yard. She looked at the sturdy house, at the endless fields, and at the vast, open sky. She had a place. She had a purpose. It was a beginning. Picking up her valise, she walked up the steps and into the Cooper house, ready to bring it back to life. The air inside was still and clean, but it lacked a certain warmth. It was a house that was lived in, but it did not feel like a home. Not yet. June set down her bag and walked to the kitchen. The first thing she did was open a window, letting in the sunlight and the scent of the prairie grass. Then she tied on her apron and began to work. The kitchen was a good space, large and square, with a heavy pine table at its center. It had been built for utility, not comfort. The shelves were sturdy, the iron stove was enormous, and a large dry sink stood against the far wall. But it was a room that held its breath. The air was still, carrying the faint, lonely scent of wood smoke and old coffee grounds. June saw not neglect, but a profound weariness. It was the kitchen of a man doing his best, a man for whom a meal was fuel and nothing more. She set about changing that, not with grand gestures, but with 100 small, quiet actions. Her first order of business was the stove. It drew poorly, sending little puffs of soot into the room with every gust of wind down the chimney. She spent a good hour clearing the flue, her hands and face becoming smudged with black. But when she was done, the fire she built caught with a clean, satisfying roar. The stove seemed to sigh with relief, its iron top beginning to radiate a steady, welcoming warmth. She found the pantry well stocked with staples, sacks of flour and cornmeal, sugar, salt, and beans. It was the larder of a practical man who planned ahead. But there was no sign of the small things that turn a pantry into a kitchen. No cinnamon, no vanilla, no jars of preserves on the shelves. Just the bare necessities. She made a mental note to speak with Alma about ordering a few spices. A little cinnamon in the cornbread could change the entire disposition of a morning. She scrubbed the big pine table until the wood grain showed, pale and clean. She found a chipped ceramic pitcher and went out to the pump, returning with fresh, cold water. She even found a small patch of tenacious mint growing by the back step and put a sprig in the pitcher. It was a small thing, a foolish thing perhaps, but it made the kitchen feel less like a workshop and more like a room where people lived. As she worked, she hummed, a soft, low tune from a hymn she had loved as a child. The sound was unfamiliar in the quiet house, a thread of gentle music weaving through the silence. She was sweeping the floor when Evan Cooper came back inside. He moved with a quietness that was surprising for a man his size, and she did not hear him until he was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. He held an empty water jug in one hand. He stopped there, looking at the room. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in the clean table, the pitcher of water with its sprig of green, the fire burning brightly and cleanly in the stove. He looked at her, at the smudges of soot on her cheek, and the determined set of her jaw. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, something complicated that he quickly suppressed. He was a man who lived behind a tall fence of his own making, and he seemed startled to find someone tidying up on his side of it. He felt an unwelcome stirring inside him, a sense of intrusion that was immediately followed by a sense of relief. It had been so long since the kitchen had felt like this, so long since a warmth that was not his own had filled the space. The memory of Martha, of her moving through this same room with an easy grace, rose up in him, sharp and painful. He had grown used to the quiet, to the emptiness. It was safe. This new presence, this humming, this inexplicable sprig of mint was not safe. It was a complication he had not bargained for. He had hired a pair of hands, not a spirit to fill the empty corners of his house. He walked to the sink and began to work the pump, the squeak and clank of the handle filling the room. He was a man who spoke with actions, and the action now was to remind himself, and her, of the nature of their arrangement. This was a place of work. She was here to perform a function. That was all. When the jug was full, he set it on the counter and turned to face her, his expression set and serious. He fumbled for the words, his voice rough from disuse. "Lady, you are here only to cook." The words hung in the air, blunt and awkward. He had not meant them to be cruel, only clear. He was trying to build the fence back up, to define the boundaries of her employment so there could be no misunderstanding. He was a man who had lost too much to risk any new attachments. He needed to keep this simple, a matter of wages paid for services rendered. June stopped her sweeping. She looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, she saw past the immense size of him, past the bluntness of his words. She saw the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, and a sadness there that he thought he kept well hidden. She saw a man terribly afraid of feeling anything again. She did not feel insulted. She felt a surprising pang of sympathy. She offered him a small, patient smile. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even and calm, "and to make the coffee less bitter, too." Her reply was so unexpected, so gentle and so keenly perceptive, that it took him entirely by surprise. A faint flush rose on his weathered cheeks. She had not bristled, had not argued. She had simply agreed, and in doing so, had shown him that she understood more than he had said. She had heard the clumsy fear beneath the clumsy words. He gave a short, jerky nod, unable to think of a reply. He picked up the water jug and retreated back outside into the familiar world of sun and wind and hard physical labor, leaving her alone in the newly warmed kitchen. June watched him go, the smile still on her lips. The fence he was trying to build, she thought, was not very sturdy at all. She went back to her sweeping, her humming a little louder now, a little more certain. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the prairie. Out in the field, Evan worked with a steady, powerful rhythm, his scythe whispering through the tall grass. The work was a comfort, a familiar penance that cleared his mind and tired his body. He did not let himself think about the woman in his house. He thought about the weather, about the price of hay, about the weak section of fence in the north pasture. He thought about anything but the scent of baking that had begun to drift out of the kitchen window, a warm, sweet smell that pulled at memories he had long ago buried. It was the smell of cornbread. Martha had made cornbread. When the sun was directly overhead, he laid down his scythe, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and started for the house. Ruth, who had been playing with corn-husk dolls in the shade of the barn, saw him and ran to join him, her small hand slipping trustingly into his big one. He was hungry. He was tired. He expected to walk into the same quiet house, to sit at the same silent table, to eat a functional meal before returning to the field. That was the rhythm of his life. He stopped on the threshold of the kitchen door, his shadow falling long across the floor. The first thing that registered was the light. The room was flooded with it, golden and warm, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that streamed through the clean window pane. The second thing was the smell. It was overwhelming now. The rich, buttery scent of the cornbread, fresh from the oven. A perfect, golden loaf sat cooling on the table. But it was not the light or the smell that held him motionless, that made the breath catch in his throat. It was the sight in the far corner of the room, in the brightest patch of sunlight. June was sitting on a low stool, and on an even smaller stool beside her sat Ruth, his shy, quiet Ruth. Between them, held open on June's lap, was one of Ruth's picture books. The girl was not just looking at the pictures. Her small finger was tracing a line of text, and her brow was furrowed in concentration. June's head was bent close to hers, her expression one of infinite patience and encouragement. Her voice was a low, gentle murmur, too soft for Evan to make out the words, but the tone was as clear as a bell. It was the sound of teaching. It was the sound of kindness. Then he heard his daughter's voice, hesitant but clear. She sounded out a word, syllable by syllable. C-A-T, cat. She looked up at June, her eyes wide with the miracle of it. June smiled and nodded, pointing to the next word. The cat sat. Ruth looked from the book to June and back again, a radiant smile spreading across her face. She had not just seen the words. She had read them. She had unlocked a secret. Her eyes, so often clouded with a quiet sorrow, were sparkling with fierce, bright pride. Evan stood rooted to the spot, a silent observer of a scene he could never have imagined. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He had come to see about his midday meal, to see if the woman he had hired was doing her job, and she was. The evidence was cooling on the table. But she was doing so much more. She was building something he had not known how to build. She was letting the light in. The blunt, awkward words he had spoken that morning echoed in his mind, shaming him. "Lady, you are here only to cook." He saw now how small those words were, how blind he had been. He had hired a cook, and he had gotten a teacher. He had sought a servant to keep his house in order, and instead, a quiet miracle was unfolding in a pool of afternoon sun. The house was no longer just a shelter from the wind. In that moment, with the smell of cornbread in the air and the sound of his daughter learning to read, it had, once again, begun to feel like a home. A new rhythm settled over the Cooper Ranch, as quiet and natural as the rising and setting of the sun. The days fell into a pattern, a gentle cadence of work and learning, of shared labor and shared meals. The house began to breathe again. Mornings belonged to the kitchen, long before dawn. June would be up, coaxing the stove to life. The scent of coffee, rich and no longer bitter, would fill the rooms, followed by the smell of sizzling bacon or fresh biscuits. By the time Evan came in from his first chores in the barn, a hearty breakfast would be waiting on the clean pine table. He and Ruth would eat while June moved about the room, her presence a quiet, constant warmth. He found he no longer bolted his food in silence. He would listen as June spoke to Ruth, asking her about her dreams or telling her a small story about a bird she had seen outside the window. He never said much, but he listened, and the silence at the table was no longer empty. It was comfortable. After the morning meal was cleared away, the porch became a classroom. June had found a small, smooth piece of slate at Alma's Mercantile and a handful of chalk nubs. This simple board became the center of Ruth's world. She would sit on a stool, her small back straight with purpose. As June guided her hand in forming the letters of the alphabet, the scratchy sound of chalk on slate became a familiar part of the midday quiet. Evan, working near the barn, would hear Ruth's small, determined voice sounding out words, followed by June's patient murmur of encouragement. He saw his daughter unfolding like a spring flower, her shyness receding to reveal a bright, inquisitive mind. She began to ask questions about everything, pointing to a flower and asking for its name, then carefully trying to write the letters on her slate. The world was no longer just a series of pictures to her. It was a book she was learning to read. The afternoons were for the hay. As the sun beat down on the fields, turning the cut grass from a vibrant green to a pale, fragrant gold. June would tie on a sunbonnet and walk out to join him. She was surprisingly strong, her movements efficient as she learned to use a long wooden rake to turn the drying hay, ensuring it cured evenly in the heat. Evan had been uncertain at first, resistant to the idea of her doing such heavy work, but she had simply picked up a rake and started, her quiet competence leaving no room for argument. He found himself working alongside her, the two of them moving in a comfortable synchronicity down the long windrows. The silence of the fields was different from the silence of the house had been, here, under the vast, open sky. Conversation came more easily. They spoke of practical things at first, the weather, the condition of the soil, the likelihood of rain, but slowly, the topics broadened. She told him about Ohio, about the green hills and the crowded town she had left behind. He found himself telling her about the ranch, about how he had chosen this particular piece of land for the way the creek ran through the lower pasture, about the day he had raised the frame of the barn with the help of his neighbors. These were stories he had not told anyone in years. One hot afternoon, as they paused for a drink of water from the canteen, June looked out over the sea of green grass that was not yet cut. She shielded her eyes with her hand, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft with wonder. "How the sun and the rain and the earth all work together to make this, all that life. Just from light and water." She smiled, a little teasingly. "It's all because of photosynthesis." She said the word with a clear, careful precision. It was a word that felt utterly foreign in the dusty, practical world of haying. Evan blinked at her, the long, strange word echoing in the quiet air. He had a vague understanding of the concept, the way a plant turns sunlight into life, but he would have called it growing. Photosynthesis, he repeated slowly, his deep voice stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. He broke the word into clumsy pieces, and it sounded like a different language entirely. June's laugh was not mocking. It was a bright, genuine sound, like the chiming of the bell on Alma's door. "Not quite," she said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "But it was a noble effort. Mr. Cooper." He felt a smile tug at the corner of his own mouth. A rare and rusty thing. He tried the word again, and this time, listening to her, he got a little closer, the sound of their shared laughter. His a low rumble and hers a light peal, drifted across the hayfield. It was a moment of simple, easy connection. A small bridge built between his world of earth and labor and her world of books and words. It was the first time he had truly laughed since Martha had been gone. In the quiet evenings, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, and Ruth was asleep in her small bed, June would often sit on the porch, a block of soft pine in her lap. She had a small, sharp knife, and with patient, skillful hands, she would carve. She was making a set of wooden spoons. One evening, Evan came out to sit on the top step to watch the stars appear in the deepening twilight. He watched her hands as she worked, her knife shaving away delicate curls of wood. She was carving a handle, and as he looked closer, he saw that she was shaping the end of it into the image of a prairie wildflower, its petals and leaves rendered in surprising detail. It was beautiful, and it was entirely unnecessary. A spoon was a tool. It did not need a flower on its handle. But as he watched her work, he understood that she was doing more than just making a tool. She was adding a touch of grace to their lives, a small, quiet beauty that had been absent for a long time. The spoon was a symbol of the way she was transforming his house, turning it from a place of mere function into a place of warmth and care. The gentle conflict, when it came, was not a clash of wills but a collision of two different worlds. It arrived in the mail pouch from town, a thick envelope containing the annual contract to supply hay to the Army cavalry post at Fort Laramie. It was his most important piece of business, the agreement that guaranteed a market for his entire crop. In years past, he had simply signed where the quartermaster told him to sign. He trusted the Army, and the dense pages of legal text were a tiresome necessity he preferred to ignore. But this year, something was different. Martha had always been the one to handle the paperwork. Her handwriting was neat and clear, and she had a mind for details that he lacked. Since her passing, he had managed, but it was a struggle. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, the contract spread out before him under the warm glow of the oil lamp. June sat opposite, mending one of Ruth's dresses, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic stitch. The house was quiet save for the chirp of crickets outside. Evan stared at the page, his brow furrowed. The words were in English, but they might as well have been in Greek. Phrases like heretofore mentioned parties, in consideration of the covenants, and indemnification clause swam before his eyes. It was not that he could not read the words. He could, but stringing them together into a coherent meaning that he could trust was another matter. He had left school at 14 to work, and his education had come from the earth, not from books. He understood the language of the seasons, the health of an animal, the feel of a coming storm. This dry, convoluted language of lawyers felt designed to confuse, to trap a man in the fine print. He sighed, a sound of deep frustration, and rubbed his hand over his tired face. June looked up from her sewing, her expression concerned. "Is something the matter, Mr. Cooper?" she asked softly. He felt a flash of defensiveness, a man's pride in his own competence. But it faded as quickly as it came. He was too tired for pride, and there was something about her, a calm and steady presence, that made it easy to be honest. "It's this contract," he said, gesturing at the papers with a sweep of his big hand. "It's a thicket of words. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not signing away the whole ranch for a few tons of hay." He had not meant to sound so weary, but the long day in the sun and the frustrating battle with the document had worn him down. June set her sewing aside and looked at the contract with a thoughtful expression. She did not pity him or condescend to him. She saw the problem for what it was, a practical challenge, like a stubborn stove flue or a field that needed turning. "They do not make it easy, do they?" she said, her voice understanding. "It seems they use 10 words when one would do." She paused, then made her offer carefully. Perhaps 2 sets of eyes would be better than 1. "We could read it through together, if you like. Slowly, just to be sure of things." Evan looked at her. It was a generous offer, a helping hand extended across the table. She was not questioning his intelligence. She was offering her own as a tool for him to use. He felt a wave of gratitude that was so profound it left him speechless. "We do not have to do it all tonight," she added, as if sensing his hesitation. "We could just take it 1 page at a time. Each night, a new page. It will not seem so daunting that way." 1 page a day. It was a simple, brilliant idea. It turned an impossible mountain into a series of small, manageable steps. He looked from her kind, earnest face to the formidable document on the table. For the first time, he felt that he could conquer it. He gave a slow nod. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. 1 page a day. I would be grateful for the help." And so, a new evening ritual began. June pulled her chair closer to the table, and they bent their heads together over the first page. She would read a sentence aloud, her clear voice cutting through the dense legal language, and then they would discuss it, making sure they both understood its meaning before moving on. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light around them, a small island of collaboration in the quiet house, in the corner of the room. The little slate board leaned against the wall, a symbol of the knowledge that was taking root in their home. On a shelf nearby, the newly finished wooden spoon, with its delicate wildflower handle, seemed to watch over them, a testament to the quiet, steady way that a house was being remade into a home. 1 word, 1 day at a time. The last Saturday of the month arrived wrapped in a perfect blue sky, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of dust and distant wildflowers. The Clearwater Ridge Market Fair was in full swing by the time Evan guided the wagon into the bustling collection of tents, stalls, and people that had sprung up on the edge of town for years. He had treated the fair as a swift, necessary chore, a place to buy supplies and speak to the blacksmith before retreating to the solitude of his land. But today was different. He was not alone. In the wagon seat beside him, June wore a simple but becoming dress the color of cornflowers, her face shaded by a straw bonnet. In the back, nestled among blankets and a large, carefully covered basket, sat Ruth, her eyes wide with an excitement he had not seen in her since she was a very small child. They were arriving not as a man and his daughter making a brief appearance, but as a family on an outing. The thought was new and strange, and it settled in his chest with a surprising warmth. The fair was a vibrant tapestry of community life. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, fresh-baked pies, and horse liniment. Laughter and conversation mingled with the sounds of a fiddler tuning his instrument and the auctioneer practicing his rapid-fire patter. Neighbors who saw each other only from a distance now stood in clusters, catching up on news, their faces open and friendly. Evan found a spot for the wagon and began to unhitch the horses. "All right, here's the plan," June said, her voice full of a cheerful, organizing energy that he was coming to admire. She hopped down from the wagon with a light step. "Ruth, you and I will get your lemonade stand set up under that big cottonwood tree. Mr. Cooper, you can set up your hay samples. And then I must take my entry over to the bake-off tent before the judging begins." She handed him the reins, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. He was struck by how capable she seemed, how at ease in the bustling environment. She was not just managing his house, she was managing their day, and he found he did not mind in the slightest. He set up his small display near the wagon, stacking a few perfect, sweet-smelling bales of his Timothy hay. He was proud of his hay. It was clean, green, and well-cured, the result of weeks of back-breaking labor. It was a tangible representation of his skill and his provision for his daughter. From his spot, he could watch June and Ruth. They worked together, setting a small table with a checkered cloth. June placed a large stone crock of lemonade on it, full of sliced lemons, and set out a stack of tin cups. Ruth, with a seriousness that made Evan's heart ache with a gentle pride, arranged the cups in a neat pyramid. When a customer approached, it was Ruth who took the penny, her small hand steady, and who carefully ladled the lemonade into a cup. She would look up at the customer and say, "Thank you, sir," her voice small but clear. He saw Alma from the mercantile buy a cup, leaning down to tell Ruth it was the best lemonade in the whole territory, which made his daughter's face glow with a shy pleasure. Soon, June returned from the bake-off tent, a flush of excitement on her cheeks. "Well, the honey cornbread is in the hands of the judges now," she announced. "There are some mighty fine-looking pies over there. Mrs." Gable entered a peach pie that looked like a work of art. She did not seem concerned about winning, only happy to be a part of the day's festivities. The main event was the fundraising auction to build a proper schoolhouse for the children of the area. It was a cause the whole community supported, a shared belief in a better future. A man in a dusty but well-made suit approached Evan's hay display. He was of middling height, with a shrewd but not unkind face. "Good day to you," the man said, his voice businesslike. "Name's Pike. I have a freighting business over in Cheyenne. I am always looking for good quality feed for my teams." He picked up a handful of the hay, rubbing it between his fingers, then brought it to his nose. "This is good stock, clean, well-cured." "I do my best," Evan said simply. "I need to purchase a few tons to see me through the next month," Mr. Pike continued. "I have a standard contract here. If you are interested in selling—" He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. Evan took the papers. It was a much shorter, simpler document than the Army contract. He scanned the pages, his eyes picking out the important details: the price per ton, the quantity, the date of payment. The terms were fair. He had learned a great deal in his evening sessions with June, and he felt a quiet confidence as he read. It all seemed to be in order. "The terms look agreeable," Evan said, preparing to ask for a pen. June had been standing nearby, watching the interaction with a quiet interest. She stepped forward now, her expression apologetic, as if she were reluctant to interrupt. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn. Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice low and respectful, "but did you happen to notice the small appendix on the last page? The section regarding the delivery schedule?" Evan frowned. He had seen the heading but had skimmed over it, assuming it was standard boilerplate language. He turned to the last page. There, in small but clear print, was a clause stating that the first half of the delivery was expected within 3 days of signing. 3 days. It was the height of his haying season. He could not possibly spare a full day to load and haul a wagon to the freight yard in that time frame without falling dangerously behind in his own fields. It was an impossible schedule. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He had almost made a significant mistake, a promise he could not keep, which in his mind was as bad as telling a lie. He looked at June, and all he felt was a profound sense of gratitude. She had not corrected him in a way that made him feel small. She had gently guided his attention, saving him from his own haste. He turned back to Mr. Pike, his composure regained. "Thank you for pointing that out. Miss Merritt," he said, his voice steady. Then to the merchant, "Mr. Pike, this delivery schedule is a bit aggressive. I'm a one-man operation, and the haying is at its peak. I cannot spare the time for a delivery in 3 days." Mr. Pike considered this. He looked from Evan's honest, weathered face to June's intelligent, calm one. He was a businessman, but he was also a reasonable man who understood the rhythms of the land. "I see," he said, stroking his chin. "My teams are coming in sooner than expected, which is the reason for the haste. But a deal is no good to me if the other party cannot fulfill it. What schedule would work for you?" "I can have the full amount delivered in 10 days' time." Evan said, "I will bring it myself, and I will guarantee the quality is as good as this sample here." Mr. Pike thought for another moment, then nodded. 10 days it is," he said. He took a pen from his pocket, crossed out the original clause, and wrote in the new terms in a neat, clear hand, "A man who knows his own limits is a man I can trust." They both signed the amended document. Evan shook Mr. Pike's hand, the grip firm and decisive. There had been no raised voices, no angry negotiations, just a simple problem, identified and solved with quiet reason and mutual respect. As Mr. Pike walked away, Evan looked at June. He did not have the words to express the depth of his appreciation, but he hoped she saw it in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "We are a team." "Mr. Cooper," she replied with a small smile. "That is what teams do. They help each other." The rest of the day passed in a pleasant haze. June's honey cornbread won a blue ribbon in the bake-off, a fact that made Ruth swell with pride as if she had won it herself. They watched the auction for a while, Evan bidding a few dollars on a hand-carved birdhouse, a small contribution to the school fund. The ride home in the evening was quiet. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. Ruth, exhausted from the excitement and the lemonade business, fell asleep in the back of the wagon, her head pillowed on a soft blanket. That night, after Ruth was tucked into bed, Evan sat on the porch steps, leaning against a post. The air was cool and smelled of the dry earth. He felt a deep contentment, a sense of peace he had not known for a long time. The door opened, and June stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying something he had not seen before, a wooden case with leather straps. She sat on the porch swing, the chains groaning softly, and opened the case. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, was a mandolin, its wood polished to a soft gleam. "It was my mother's," she said softly, answering the unspoken question in his eyes. She lifted the instrument and settled it in her lap. After a moment of tuning the strings, she began to play. The music that filled the night was not loud or complicated. It was a simple melody, a folk song that was both sweet and a little sad. The notes seemed to hang in the air, weaving through the chirping of the crickets. It was the sound of a home, not just a house. It spoke of evenings by the fire, of shared stories, of a life that was more than just work and survival. After a few moments, he heard another sound, a soft, high humming. He turned and saw Ruth standing in the doorway in her nightgown, her eyes half closed, humming along to the melody. She had been drawn from her sleep by the music. She padded over to the porch swing and curled up beside June, her head resting on June's lap, her small body relaxing into sleep as the music continued. Evan watched them, a silhouette of grace and tenderness against the starlit sky. The music, the sleeping child, the woman who had brought this peace into his world. It all settled deep inside him. A bond was being forged on this porch, not with contracts or formal words, but with quiet acts of care, with shared laughter, with the simple, profound beauty of a song played under the stars. He did not speak. He did not need to. He just sat and listened, letting the music wash over him, feeling the sturdy walls of the fortress he had built around his heart begin, ever so slowly, to crumble away. The music of the mandolin did not last. The days that followed the market fair grew taut and brittle. A hot, dry wind blew in from the south, a relentless breath that scoured the prairie and leached the moisture from everything it touched. It was a wind that frayed the nerves and whispered of danger. The sky, once a brilliant blue, became a pale, hazy canvas. The sun a white-hot coin glaring down through the dust. The grasses in the fields, so recently a fragrant, golden promise of prosperity, turned the color of old parchment and crackled underfoot. The windmill no longer squeaked a weary complaint. It spun with a frantic, high-pitched whine, day and night, pumping water for the thirsty cattle. A tension settled over Clearwater Ridge. Men gathered at the blacksmith shop or in front of Alma's mercantile, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the horizons. They spoke in low tones about the lack of rain, about the fires over in the next county. A spark, a carelessly dropped match, a bolt of lightning from a dry storm. That was all it would take to turn the entire territory into a sea of flame. The hay, so carefully cut and cured, now felt less like a comfort and more like a liability. Every barn, filled to the rafters, was a tinderbox waiting for a stray ember. Evan felt the tension in his bones. He spent his days plowing a wide black firebreak around the perimeter of his property. A dark scar of turned earth meant to halt the advance of a grass fire. The work was grueling under the relentless sun, his clothes constantly stiff with sweat and dirt. In the evenings, the community organized. A watch was established, with 2 men riding the ridges each night, their eyes peeled for the first telltale glow of a fire. Evan took his turn without complaint. It was the duty of a neighbor. June watched and understood. The danger was a palpable thing, a guest that had sat down at their table. She did not panic. She turned her practical mind to the problem. The greatest danger to their livelihood, she knew, was the big barn, packed with the hay Evan had just contracted to sell. While he worked on the outer defenses, she focused on the heart of the ranch. She took a heavy hoe and a rake from the tool shed and began her own project. With a grim determination, she started to clear a wide circle of bare earth around the barn itself. She scraped away every blade of dry grass, every weed, every fallen leaf, until a perfect ring of dark soil surrounded the building. It was back-breaking work, the sun beating down on her neck, the wind whipping strands of hair from under her bonnet and stinging her eyes with dust. Ruth, seeing her work, came out to help. "What are you doing?" "June," she asked, her small face serious. "We are making a safe place for the barn," June explained, pausing to wipe her brow with the back of her glove. "Fire is a very fast runner, but it cannot run across bare dirt. We are making a line that it cannot cross." The explanation satisfied Ruth's practical mind. "Can I help?" "You certainly can," June said, her smile warm despite her fatigue. "You see all these dry leaves the wind has blown against the corral fence? They are like little pieces of paper, just waiting for a spark. If you can gather them all into this bucket for me, that would be a very important job. She made it sound like the most crucial task on the entire ranch. Ruth set to work with a solemn sense of purpose, her small fingers carefully picking up each leaf and twig. She was a safe distance from June's heavy tools, and the work was light, but she felt she was a part of the effort. She was a guardian of the corral, a partner in the protection of their home. Evan saw them from the far field, the tall, determined woman and the small, diligent child, working together under the vast, hostile sky. The sight filled him with a feeling that was fierce and protective and profoundly gentle all at once. They were not just his housekeeper and his daughter. They were his family, standing their ground. The fire came on a moonless night. Evan was at home, having ridden the watch the night before. He was tired, but he could not sleep. The wind howled around the corners of the house, a mournful, angry sound. He sat in the dark kitchen, sipping a cup of cool water, when he saw it, a faint, flickering orange light on the distant horizon, far to the northeast. It was on the open rangeland, miles from any homestead, but it was there, and with a wind like this, miles meant nothing. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots. He did not need to shout. June was already there, standing in the doorway in her robe, her face pale in the faint light. She had seen it too. "It is far off," she said, her voice steady, "on the old Henderson property. I think it has been abandoned for years." "The wind is pushing it this way," he said, his voice grim. "I have to go." "I know," she said. "Be careful." She turned and lit a lamp, the sudden flare of light chasing the shadows from the room. Her movements were calm and efficient. "I will keep a lamp in the window, and I will have coffee and water ready." She was not a woman who would weep and wring her hands. She was a woman who would put the coffee pot on. He saddled his horse in record time, the big animal snorting nervously, smelling the smoke on the wind. As he rode out, he saw lights appearing in the windows of the neighboring ranches. The watch rider had done his job. From all directions, men were riding toward the glow. When he reached the fire line, it was a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight. A long, jagged wall of flame, 10 feet high in places, was eating its way across the prairie, the dry grass igniting with a sound like a continuous roll of thunder. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the heat was intense even from 100 yards away. The men of Clearwater Ridge were already there, a small, determined army armed with shovels, hoes, and wet burlap sacks. They were attacking the flanks of the fire, trying to narrow its front, beating at the flames and throwing dirt on the glowing embers. Evan joined them, his powerful shoulders driving his shovel deep into the earth, creating a desperate, hasty firebreak. The work was brutal, a battle against a relentless enemy. The smoke burned his lungs and the heat blistered his skin. For an hour, they fought, holding their ground but making little headway against the main advance of the fire. Then, through the smoke, he saw a wagon approaching, driven hard. It was June. He felt a surge of alarm, thinking of Ruth, but then he saw that the wagon was loaded with milk cans full of water and a large box of food. Alma was beside her, her face set with determination. June had not been content to wait at home. She had driven to the nearest ranches, waking those who had not yet seen the fire, and organized a supply line. She pulled the wagon to a safe spot and immediately began handing out cups of water and thick sandwiches to the exhausted men. She moved through the chaotic scene with an unwavering calm, her presence a beacon of sense and order. Evan took a cup of water from her, his throat raw. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough. "It is too dangerous." "The men are thirsty," she replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her eyes were not on him, but on the fire. She looked at the way the smoke was blowing, the way the flames bent and danced before the wind. Then she looked back toward the unburned prairie, in the direction the fire was headed. "Evan," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. He had not realized she had stopped using his formal title. "You are all fighting it where it is, but the wind is beginning to shift. It is turning more to the west." He stopped and felt the wind on his own smoke-grimed cheek. She was right. The subtle change had been lost on him in the heat of the battle, but she, from her vantage point, had seen it. A westward shift would drive the fire directly toward the cluster of ranches that included his own. "If it gets into that long coulee," she said, pointing into the darkness, "the wind will funnel through it like a chimney. You will never stop it then. You need to get ahead of it. You need to backburn from a new line. Over there," she pointed again, "to a low ridge a half-mile to the west. If you can burn a line along that ridge, you can force the main fire to burn itself out when it gets there." The men nearby had stopped working and were listening. It was a bold strategy. Backfiring was dangerous. It meant setting a new fire, trusting that you could control it, trusting that your fire break was wide enough to hold it. But Evan looked at the main fire, and he looked at the ridge, and he looked at the calm, intelligent face of the woman before him. He saw the logic in her plan. It was not a desperate guess. It was a calculated risk based on a clear observation of the changing conditions. He turned to the other men. "She is right," he said, his voice carrying with an authority that no one questioned. "Fighting it here is a losing game. We move to the ridge. We will make our stand there." There was no argument. The men trusted Evan Cooper. They followed him, a weary, smoke-blackened crew, to the new position. With a renewed urgency, they cleared a wide trench along the top of the ridge. Then, with torches made from burlap sacks dipped in kerosene, they did the terrifying work of setting the prairie on fire themselves, dropping the flames on the side of the trench facing the advancing inferno. Evan stood with June and watched as their controlled fire burned slowly against the wind, creating a wide, black belt of safety. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the flames. He saw no fear, only a focused intelligence. She had seen the whole battlefield, not just the small piece in front of her. In the midst of chaos, she had provided the one thing they needed most, a clear, strategic thought. The respect he felt for her in that moment was immense. It was a respect that went far beyond her abilities in a kitchen or with a child's reading lesson. It was a respect for her mind, for her courage, for the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. An hour later, the main fire reached their blackened firebreak. It met the barren ground and, with nowhere to go and nothing to consume, it faltered. The towering wall of flame shrank, starved of fuel, and finally died, leaving only a glowing red line of embers against the dark earth. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted men. They had won. The fight was over. The prairie was scarred and blackened, but no homes had been lost. No lives had been endangered. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, smoky light over the scene, Evan stood on the ridge and looked toward his own ranch. It stood untouched, safe and whole in the distance. He had defended it with his strength, but she, he realized, had defended it with her wisdom. The fire had tested them all, and in the ashes, he saw with a stunning clarity that June Merritt was not just a woman who had come to cook in his house. She was a woman with whom he could stand and face the fire. In the aftermath of the fire, a fragile peace settled over the land. The wind lost its furious edge, and a few days later, a gentle, soaking rain arrived, washing the ash from the air and turning the blackened prairie a darker shade of charcoal. The smell of smoke lingered for a week, a ghostly reminder of the danger they had faced. But beneath it, the sweet, clean scent of wet earth returned. The community, forged closer by the shared ordeal, began to heal. Neighbors stopped by the Cooper Ranch not just on business, but to share a cup of coffee, to thank June again for her clear-headed thinking, to marvel at how much Ruth had grown. The house, which had once been an isolated outpost, was becoming a quiet hub, a place of warmth and welcome. The day arrived for Evan to ride into town and sign the formal hay contract with the county. It was the culmination of his year's work, the moment that turned sweat and sun into security for the winter ahead. In years past, he had approached this day with a sense of weary duty, a necessary chore that involved papers he did not fully trust and men with whom he had little in common. But this morning was different. As he dressed in a clean shirt, he felt a quiet hum of anticipation, not anxiety. The thick document, which had once seemed like an insurmountable wall of text, now felt like a familiar landscape. He and June had gone over every line in their evening sessions, dissecting the legal language until it yielded its simple, practical meaning. He understood his obligations, his rights, and the guarantees he was making. June had his coffee ready for him at the table. She said nothing about the contract, but he saw in her eyes a quiet confidence in him that was more encouraging than any spoken words. She handed him a small parcel wrapped in a clean cloth. "For your lunch," she said, "and do not let that county clerk rush you. You have every right to take your time and read what you are signing." He nodded. Taking the parcel, "I will not," he said, and the words were a promise to her as much as to himself. The county office was a small, tidy room in the courthouse, smelling of paper and sealing wax. The manager, a Mr. Abernathy, was a man with spectacles perched on his nose and a perpetually serious expression. He was a man who lived by the letter of the law and expected others to do the same. He retrieved the contract from a drawer and laid it on the desk between them, gesturing to the signature line with a pen. "It is the standard agreement. Mr. Cooper," he said, his tone suggesting that any delay was an unnecessary waste of his valuable time, same as last year. Evan did not pick up the pen. He pulled the document toward him, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle with the papers. He began to read. He did not skim. He read each word, each sentence, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. He felt Mr. Abernathy's impatient gaze on him, but he was not deterred. This was his business, his livelihood. June's words echoed in his mind. He had every right. When he reached a section detailing the standards of quality, he paused. He looked up, his gaze direct and steady. "I would like to read this part aloud, if I may," he said, "just to ensure we are in complete accord." Mr. Abernathy raised an eyebrow, surprised, but he nodded. "As you wish." Evan's voice, when he began to read, was a low, steady rumble. It was not the voice of a scholar, but it was the voice of a man who understood what he was saying. The aforementioned hay, he read, shall be of first-rate quality, free from mold, dust, and noxious weeds, properly cured and suitable in every respect for the feeding of cavalry mounts. Any bales found to be substandard upon delivery will be rejected at the supplier's expense. He stopped and looked at the manager. "That is clear enough," he said. "My hay will meet that standard." Abernathy looked at him with a new expression. The impatience was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "You know, Mr. Cooper," he said, leaning back in his chair, "most ranchers just sign the thing. It is refreshing to deal with a man who takes the time to understand the words. It makes for good business." Evan felt a quiet surge of pride. It was not a boastful pride, but a deep, solid satisfaction in his own competence. He had not been tricked. He had not been rushed. He had met the world of words and contracts on his own terms and had not been found wanting. He picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed his name at the bottom of the page. The letters were a bit clumsy, the script of a man more comfortable with a shovel than a pen, but the signature was firm and clear. He was Evan Cooper, and he stood by his word and by his name. The ride home was filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. The contract was signed, the price was fair, and the winter was secure. He thought about the small pouch of coins that would come with the first payment, how he would give some to June to buy the spices she wanted, how he would buy Ruth a new pair of sturdy boots. These were the simple, satisfying rewards of his labor. The land had provided, and he had done his part. He reached the ranch as the afternoon sun was slanting low, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was peaceful. the house quiet. He swung down from his horse and walked toward the porch, his boots making soft thudding sounds on the earth. And then he stopped. He saw them. The porch, which for so long had been just a place to leave his muddy boots, was transformed. A clematis vine, which he had thought long dead, had been coaxed back to life and was beginning to climb a trellis he had not even noticed before. June was sitting in the porch swing, her mending in her lap, her movements slow and relaxed. Beside her, on a small stool, sat Ruth, but she was not looking at pictures. She held a small, proper book in her hands, one that June must have ordered from Alma's, and she was reading. She was not sounding out the words one by one, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was reading fluently, her small, clear voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. It was a tale about a rabbit and a fox, and Ruth gave each animal its own distinct voice, her expression changing with the drama of the narrative. She read with a confidence and a joy that was so pure it almost took Evan's breath away. June was not instructing her. She was simply listening, a soft, proud smile on her face, her head tilted as she enjoyed the performance. Evan stood there in the shadow of the barn, a silent witness to this quiet, revolutionary scene, a wave of understanding, so powerful it felt like a physical blow, washed over him. The pieces of the past few months, which he had experienced as a series of separate events, suddenly clicked together into a single, luminous picture. He remembered his own clumsy words, spoken in the kitchen on her first day. "Lady, you are here only to cook." The memory now filled him with a deep and profound shame for his own blindness. He had brought a woman into his house to perform a task, to cook his meals and sweep his floors. He had tried to build a fence around her role, to keep her confined to the simple, practical needs of the household. But she had quietly, patiently, and without a single word of complaint, dismantled that fence. She had refused to be confined. She had not just cooked his food, she had brought flavor and warmth and companionship back to his table. She had not just cleaned his house, she had filled it with light and music and laughter. And most important of all, she had taken his shy, quiet daughter, a child who was slowly retreating from the world, and had given her a key. She had given her the gift of words, the magic of stories. She had opened a door for Ruth into a world of infinite possibility, a world he had never known how to show her. The kitchen had become a classroom, the porch had become a stage, and his house, his lonely, silent house, had become a home. He saw it with a clarity that was almost painful. This was what he had been missing, what he had not even known he was searching for. It was not just a housekeeper he needed. It was this warmth, this life, this woman. He took a deep breath, the decision forming in his mind not as a question, but as a certainty. It was the only path forward that made any sense. He walked out of the shadow and up the porch steps. They both looked up as he approached. Their reading lesson interrupted. Papa Ruth said, her face bright. "I was just reading to June about the clever rabbit." "I heard," he said, his voice softer than he intended. It sounded like a fine story. He looked at June, his gaze steady. "The contract is signed," he said. "Everything went well." "I am so glad to hear that," she said, her smile genuine. He stood before them, a towering, awkward figure, searching for the right words. He was not a man built for speeches. Simple and direct was the only way he knew. "June," he began, his voice a low rumble. "When I hired you, it was for the season, to help with the haying." She nodded, her expression becoming watchful, uncertain of where this was leading. "The haying is almost done," he continued, "but I find myself in need of your help in other ways." He gestured toward the neighboring ranches, a sweep of his hand that took in the whole valley. "There are other children out here. The Johnson boys. Little Sarah from the Gable place. They have no school, no teacher. They are growing up like I did, with their heads full of practical things but not enough words to shape their thoughts. He looked back at her, his heart in his eyes. "What you have done for Ruth, it is more than I ever could have done. You have given her a gift beyond price." He took another breath. "I would like to ask you to stay, not just as a housekeeper. I want to build a real schoolhouse, right here, but until we can, this porch will do. I want to hire you to be the teacher for the children of Clearwater Ridge, to stay here, and to make this house, to make this a place where things can grow. Not just hay, but children, too." He had said it. The offer was on the table. It was more than a job. It was an invitation to build a life, to put down roots, to become a permanent part of his world, of their family. June stared at him, her eyes wide. The mending lay forgotten in her lap. She had come here seeking employment, a safe harbor for a season. He was offering her a purpose, a vocation, a central role in the life of a community. She saw the sincerity in his face, the deep, unspoken plea in his eyes. He was not just offering her a position. He was asking her to stay because he and his daughter needed her. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Slowly, she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Evan, I will stay." The first real frost of autumn had come and gone, leaving the mornings sharp and silvered and the leaves of the cottonwood trees along the creek a brilliant, shimmering gold. The season of haying was over, the barn was full, and a deep sense of provision and accomplishment had settled over the Cooper Ranch. The porch classroom was now a daily reality, with 4 more children from neighboring homesteads arriving each morning on horseback or in carts, their lunch pails rattling, the sound of children's voices, reciting their letters or laughing at a story, now mingled with the lowing of the cattle and the creak of the windmill, weaving a new and vibrant life into the fabric of the ranch. The autumn festival was the town's way of celebrating the harvest, a collective exhalation of breath after a long season of hard work. Evan drove the wagon into Clearwater Ridge not with the hurried purpose of a man on an errand, but with the relaxed gait of a man bringing his family to a party. June sat beside him, wearing the same cornflower blue dress she had worn to the summer fair, but with a warm wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Ruth, in the back, could barely contain her excitement, her legs swinging back and forth. Kicking gently against a sack of potatoes Evan was delivering to Alma. The town square had been transformed. Strings of paper lanterns, painted in festive shades of orange and red, were strung between the buildings. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting corn, and spiced apple cider. A long table groaned under the weight of pies, cakes, and breads for the community supper later that evening. In the center of the square, a wooden platform had been erected, and a fiddler was already warming up, his lively tune setting feet to tapping. My, don't you 3 look like a picture?" Alma called out from the doorway of her mercantile, wiping her hands on her apron. "Evan Cooper, I have not seen you look this relaxed since before the big flood of '79. This woman must be a miracle worker." She gave June a hearty wink. Evan felt a familiar flush creep up his neck, but this time it was not one of embarrassment. It felt more like warmth. "We have had a good year." "Alma," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "That you have," she said, her shrewd, kind eyes moving to Ruth. "And I hear we are to have a special performance from a certain young scholar later today." Ruth ducked her head, a blush coloring her cheeks. But she could not hide her proud smile. The plan, hatched by June and the town council, was for Ruth to give a short reading as part of the festivities, a way to showcase the progress of the new porch school and encourage more families to enroll their children come spring. The day unfolded in a series of simple pleasures. Evan found himself standing with the other ranchers, talking not of drought or fire, but of the weight of their calves and the prospects for a mild winter. June was immediately swept into a circle of women discussing recipes and quilting patterns, her laughter mingling with theirs as if she had been a part of their circle for years. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the fiddler struck up a lively tune, and the square dancing began. Evan, who had not danced in years, found himself led by the hand onto the packed dirt square by June. He was clumsy at first, his large body unused to the quick steps and turns, but June's guidance was light and sure, her smile unwavering. He found himself laughing, a real, unreserved laugh, as he swung her around, the paper lanterns and the smiling faces of his neighbors blurring into a warm collage of light and color. As twilight settled, the lanterns were lit, casting a soft, magical glow over the square. The townspeople gathered around the platform for the evening's announcements. The mayor spoke, thanking everyone for their hard work during the harvest and for their bravery during the fire. Then he smiled, and now, he announced, his voice booming with pride, "We have a special treat. As you all know, we have been blessed this season with a new teacher in our community. Miss June Merritt has started a small school out at the Cooper Ranch, and she has asked one of her star pupils to give us a small demonstration of what a little bit of learning can do. Folks, please welcome Miss Ruth Cooper." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. June gave Ruth's hand a final squeeze of encouragement and guided her up the 2 steps onto the platform. For a moment, standing there alone in the lantern light, Ruth looked very small. She clutched her book to her chest, her eyes wide as she looked out at all the expectant faces. Evan's heart clenched, a fierce, protective instinct rising in him. He wanted to stride forward and scoop her up, to shield her from the pressure of all those eyes. But then Ruth looked over and found June's face in the crowd. June gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, her expression one of perfect calm and complete faith. That was all it took. Ruth took a deep breath, opened her book, and began to read. She had chosen a short, simple story about a seed that grows into a tall sunflower. Her voice, at first a little shaky, grew stronger and clearer with each sentence. A hush fell over the crowd. They were not just listening to a child read. They were witnessing a promise being fulfilled. They were seeing the future they were all working for, a future where their children would have opportunities they themselves had never known. When she finished, she looked up, her face earnest in the soft light. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, and then the square erupted in applause. It was not polite clapping. It was a roar of genuine, heartfelt approval. Men whistled and stomped their feet. Women wiped tears from their eyes. Evan stood frozen, the sound washing over him. He felt a pride so immense, so powerful. It was a physical ache in his chest. That was his daughter, his Ruth, standing tall and brave, sharing the gift that June had given her. Later, as the community supper was in full swing, Evan found June standing by herself for a moment, away from the noise, looking up at the lanterns. He walked over and stood beside her. "She did well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was wonderful," June replied, her own voice soft. "I knew she would be." They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the sounds of the festival, a pleasant murmur in the background. Evan reached into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around the small, heavy object he had placed there that morning. He had been thinking about this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. This felt right. "June," he began, his voice a little rough. He cleared his throat. "What you have done, for Ruth, for me, for this whole place, thank you is not a big enough word." He pulled the object from his pocket and held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was a ring. It was simple, made of silver that had been worn smooth with time, with a single, small turquoise stone set in the center. It was not fancy, but it had a quiet, enduring beauty. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice low. "She gave it to my father when they were married. He gave it back to me before he passed." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a profound sincerity. "This is not... I am not asking for that. It is too soon for such things. but I wanted you to have it, as a token, a promise, not of marriage, but of partnership, of respect, to show that you have a place with us, a permanent place." June looked from the ring in his hand to the earnestness in his face. She understood. He was not offering her a proposal, which would have been overwhelming and premature. He was offering her something far more meaningful at that moment. He was offering her a place in the story of his family, a symbol of the bond they had forged through work and trust and a prairie fire. He was formally acknowledging that she was no longer just an employee, but an essential part of their lives. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of being truly seen, truly valued. She did not hesitate. She picked up the ring and slid it onto the third finger of her right hand. It fit perfectly. She held her hand up in the lantern light, admiring the soft gleam of the silver. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile full of the warmth and wit that he had come to cherish. She looked at him, her eyes dancing. "It is a beautiful promise, Evan," she said softly. Then she added, a teasing glint in her eye, "And I will tell you this. If this ring can teach you how to say the word photosynthesis without stumbling, then I might be inclined to think about other promises, down the road." The tension in his shoulders, a tension he had not even been aware of, suddenly dissolved. A deep, rumbling laugh escaped him, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. She laughed with him, a clear, bright sound that mingled with the music from the square. Standing there, surrounded by the soft glow of the lanterns and the warmth of their shared community, they were no longer just a rancher and his housekeeper. They were two people who had found in each other a partner, a friend, and the quiet, certain promise of a future as bright and hopeful as the festival lights around them. The world outside turned white. The first snow of winter arrived not in a blizzard, but as a quiet, steady blessing. Each flake a whispered promise of rest for the weary land. It covered the blackened scar of the prairie fire with a blanket of pure, immaculate peace. It clung to the bare branches of the cottonwoods, softened the sharp lines of the corral fence, and muffled the world in a profound and gentle silence. For the Cooper Ranch, it was not an exile. It was an embrace. The long, hard season of work was over, and the season of the hearth had begun. Life drew inward, centering on the warmth of the big iron stove in the kitchen. The porch classroom, now enclosed with thick canvas walls and a small pot-belly stove of its own, was a hive of activity each morning. The 4 children from the neighboring ranches arrived bundled in coats and scarves, their cheeks red from the cold, their eyes bright with the prospect of learning. June had created a haven of warmth and knowledge. The air inside smelled of chalk dust, drying wool, and the faint, sweet scent of the apples she always had warming on the stove for their midday treat. Ruth was no longer just a student. She was a leader. She would take the younger children aside, her head bent close to theirs, and patiently guide them through their letters, her voice a miniature echo of June's own gentle tone. Often, the day's lessons would end with Ruth reading a story aloud to her small, captivated audience, her voice full of confidence as she navigated the adventures of pirates and princesses, of talking animals and faraway lands. The heart of the house, more than ever, was the kitchen. The scent of June's baking was a constant presence, a warm and welcoming greeting. Honey cornbread, molasses cookies, slow-simmered stews, and loaves of hearty whole wheat bread seemed to emerge from the oven in a magical, endless procession. It was food that did more than fill the belly. It fortified the soul against the winter chill. The kitchen table, once a place of silent, functional meals, was now the center of their world. It was where lessons were reviewed, where Ruth practiced her sums on her slate, where June planned her curriculum, and where, in the evenings, Evan Cooper found a new kind of peace. He would sit at one end of the table, the ranch's ledger book spread open before him under the steady glow of the oil lamp. In months past, this book had been a source of frustration, a jumble of numbers and scrawled notes he could barely decipher. Now, it was a tool he had mastered. With a slow, deliberate hand, he would make his entries, the pen feeling less foreign in his grip with each passing night. His handwriting, once a barely legible scrawl, was becoming neat and clear. He wrote down the figures from the Army contract, the sale to Mr. Pike, the cost of seed for the spring. It was the story of his year, written in his own hand, a testament to a new kind of competence. He was not just a man of the land anymore. He was becoming a man of letters, in his own quiet way. He would look up from his work to see Ruth asleep in a chair by the fire, a book fallen into her lap, and June mending a shirt, the silver ring on her right hand catching the lamplight. In those moments, a feeling of such profound contentment would wash over him that it felt like a physical warmth, a force stronger and more enduring than any winter storm. One evening, a few days before Christmas, the snow had stopped, and the sky was a vast, dark sheet of velvet, glittering with a million stars. The cold was sharp and clean. The children had been sent home early with bags of June's gingerbread cookies. A deep, comfortable quiet settled over the house. Ruth was already asleep, dreaming of the holiday to come. Evan looked across the table at June, who was reading a book of her own, her face soft and thoughtful in the lamplight. "June," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. She looked up, a questioning smile on her lips. "Would you walk outside with me for a moment?" he asked. "The stars are bright tonight." She put her book down without hesitation and followed him to the door. He helped her into a warm cloak, and they stepped out onto the porch. The air was so cold it made them gasp, their breath turning to instant clouds of white. Evan had taken the painted paper lanterns from the autumn festival and, with great care, had strung them along the porch eaves, a line of festive color against the snow-covered landscape. He had lit them tonight, and they cast a soft, magical glow, turning the simple porch into a fairy palace. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, simply looking at the brilliant, silent stars. Evan felt a nervous energy he had not felt since he was a young man. He had planned this moment, rehearsed the words in his head while mending harnesses in the barn, but now that the time had come, they felt clumsy and inadequate. He looked at June, at the way the lantern light caught the auburn of her hair and the kindness in her eyes. He thought of the empty, silent man he had been just one season ago, and the change in his life felt as vast and miraculous as the night sky above them. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. They were cold, and he chafed them gently with his own large, warm ones. "June," he began, his voice deeper than usual. "Do you remember what this house was like when you first came here?" She nodded, her gaze steady on his face. "It was quiet," she said softly. "It was empty," he corrected her gently. "It was a place to sleep and eat. It was a shelter. It had a roof and it had walls. And that was all it had." He took a breath, gathering his courage to say the words that were in his heart. "This house has had a roof and walls for a long time. But you came, and you gave it laughter. You gave it letters. You gave it light." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up into her eyes. The sincerity there was a powerful, unwavering force. "I am not the same man I was when you arrived. And this is not the same house. You did not just fill a position. June, you filled a space in our lives that I did not even know was hollow. You have made this a home again." He paused, his heart thudding in his chest. This was the final, most important step. "I am asking you to make it a home for good. I am asking you to be my wife, to let me and Ruth be your family, and to let us be yours. I am asking you to help me build a life, not just get through one." He had said it. The question hung in the cold, clear air between them, as bright and fragile as a star. June's eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. They simply shone in the lantern light, reflecting the profound emotion of the moment. There was no surprise in her expression, only a deep, serene joy. It felt as if they had been walking toward this moment since the day she first arrived. She did not need words. She simply squeezed his hands, her grip firm and sure, and nodded. Her smile, when it came, was as warm and as certain as the fire burning in the hearth inside. It was an answer that promised a lifetime of warmth, of shared stories, of a family built not just on necessity, but on a foundation of profound respect and a quiet, enduring love. He slid the silver ring from her right hand and, with a touch that was both reverent and sure, placed it on her left. It was no longer just a promise of partnership. It was a promise of everything. Later, as they stood just inside the doorway, stamping the snow from their boots before returning to the warmth of the fire, the light from the kitchen lamp fell upon the small slate board hanging on the wall. At some point during the day, Ruth had erased her sums and, in her neatest, most careful printing, had written a new sentence there. It was a simple truth, one they had all discovered together over the course of the changing seasons. The wooden spoon with the wildflower carved on its handle rested on a shelf nearby, a silent testament to the beauty that had been brought into their lives. And on the board, the chalk letters seemed to glow with a quiet wisdom, a final, perfect summary of their story. Home is where we learn each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can discover this story.